Do you think there's a connection between these countries, between Russia, Iran, Palestine?
Well, it goes back to this thing I was saying before. The United States, to be global hegemon, has to be hegemon in every region. So that means with the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953, who was a democratic, fairly somewhat progressive leader of Iran, was overthrown because he wanted to nationalize the oil industry, and the British didn't want it, neither did the Americans. And so they clearly well documented went in through it.
Yeah.
Well, MI6 actually led it, but supported by the CIA.
Okay.
But they created a situation. Iran's a big. See, some countries are just suited for some power because they're big. So Iran's a big country. Canada's small. So Canada's not going to be a regional anything, but it can be of some use, as I say, as a junior partner to the Americans. But Iran's big and has the population, resources with oil and gas and other things. Before all these sanctions, had a relatively advanced industrial sector. It has the wherewithal to be a power in the region. Mm-hmm. Well, if you want to be, if you can't incorporate Iran into the American system, then you got to suppress its growth. Excuse me. And so Iran has its own nationalist interests, which are essentially capitalist. I mean, they have a theocracy, but they have a big capitalist oligarchy there, and many of the leading religious figures are themselves multimillionaires, maybe billionaires.
I get the impression that the theocracy in Iran isn't well liked by a majority of the people in Iran. I mean, just based on the women.
I don't know if it's a majority. I think there is widespread disenchantment.
Yeah.
Certainly amongst women, certainly amongst urban women. Apparently in the recent movements, opposition movements, there was a lot more support in rural Iran. In the past, rural Iran has been more supportive of the government, the theocrats. I have no idea what legitimate polling is, but one thing is for certain, I've been told by every Iranian I know, the more antagonistic the Americans are to Iran, the more sanctions there are, the more support the Iranian government gets, because people consider it humiliating and indignity. The way Iran gets talked about and treated in the West, it strengthens the theocracy. And the American leaders, planners, they know it. So maybe they don't mind having this Iranian threat out there. It serves a lot of purposes. It serves a lot of purposes for Israel to have an Iranian threat. It justifies having essentially now an authoritarian government, a completely militarized economy. An antagonistic Iran is very useful. The same thing goes for Russia. Why, after the fall of the Soviet Union, why wasn't Russia incorporated into Western Europe?
Yes, I agree.
They wanted to be.
Putin wanted to join NATO at one time.
There was talks about it. Yeltsin certainly wanted to. Yeah. They wanted to normalize. There was even talk about some kind of membership of the EU. So why didn't that happen? And the answer, I think, is clear. For the same issues with Iran, Russia is a big country. It has a big population. It has nuclear weapons. It had a relatively advanced industry. Mm-hmm. It has the potential for real regional power. Do you want that in Western Europe? What about I'm talking now, we meaning, from an American point of view. Damned if I'll take responsibility for the American. He's saying it that way. Imagine if Russia was incorporated as part of the EU, as even in NATO, but forget NATO for now. Imagine if there'd been a Russian-German alliance. Imagine that economy. I mean, the EU is already almost the same size as the American economy if you put it all together. The population certainly is the same size. But imagine you add Russia to that. What do they need the U.S. for? You know, the whole rationale for NATO, with being a U.S.-dominated NATO, is the Russian threat. Otherwise, what's the point? So if you incorporate Russia into Europe in a normal, legitimate, capitalist way, what the hell do they need the U.S. for? So it was really in the American interest not to allow things to get normalized with Russia. And by restricting a natural development, natural capitalist development of Russia, they sowed the seeds for what has become a totally toxic religious nationalist ideology that is very dangerous. But they did the same. Now, I don't want to compare in any direct way Putin to Hitler, because he's done nothing like that. And the Americans, if anyone you want to compare to something that comes close to German crimes, you're going to have to point to the U.S. before you could ever point to Putin. But that said, it is a toxic, nationalist, aggressive state. What they've done in Ukraine is illegal. But this all, even though the U.S. helped create this situation. Now, well, what I was going to say is they also helped to create Hitler. They thought Hitler was going to just attack the Soviet Union, and FDR did nothing until the very end to stop American corporations from sending vehicles and other kinds of industrial output to Hitler. In fact, I've heard it said by historians that Hitler could never have invaded, even in the beginning, without American vehicles. Henry Ford was a big supporter of Hitler. I mean, this is fairly well known. He used to send Hitler money every year on his birthday and was given a big award by the Nazis. In fact, Hitler said he learned about how to message anti-Semitism from the newspaper that Ford used to put out in Detroit.
Yeah, actually, I think it also was the eugenics, Lindbergh and stuff. He was impressed with that, and that's where he.
So all of these things have to be looked at. That it's not just the U.S. as the evil bad guy. It's a global system within which every country strives. All of these big capitalist countries strive for the interests of their own elites. It's a class question, but some are in better position than others. So now the elites in Western Europe, they've been groomed. The ones that were willing to survive under the U.S. umbrella have been groomed to power as part of the U.S. system.
Right.
And by keeping Russia out of it and nuclear power, it means the Western European countries are dependent on an American nuclear umbrella. And somehow in their, the whole thing is completely insane, because as if this nuclear umbrella is going to save you. I mean, it's nuts. If something starts, say goodbye to Europe in no time. So what does it mean we need to do? I mean, we need to educate people and talk about this as a class question. Like take Ukraine, for example. I think the people of Ukraine, and when I say people, I mean the whole of the people, including the elites, but including workers and ordinary people, they have a right to resist an illegal invasion. But should they? And should they the way it's happening? And what I mean by that is, when it became clear, and it became clear very early on, that the Russians were going to be able, at the very least, to control Donbas and Crimea, at the least that. Why keep fighting on the Ukrainian side? Why tens and hundreds of thousands of lives lost? So that the Ukrainian elites can regain control of Donbas and maybe Crimea, although that was unlikely. Like, why all these workers dying so that this utterly corrupt Ukrainian oligarchy can regain control, like why do that? Now I understand the nationalist urge, and they do, in terms of legality, had a right to resist that Russian invasion. Mm-hmm. But why hundreds of thousands of lives to fight to some stalemate, which everyone was predicting early on? Why not acknowledge, well, actually what should have been done before there was ever an invasion, why not take NATO off the table? Why
not put it on the table? Why not have NATO troops in Ukraine to deter Russia at the time?
Then you're asking for fucking world war. No.
I think we got a world war as it is.
No, we don't.
I understand what you're saying. So
Ukraine, one of the main justifications for the invasion was that Ukraine was going to wind up in NATO. And the truth of it was they weren't.
Yeah,
Turkey
that's
and
true.
France were against it. Turkey was, in all likely, they were not going to get consensus. And there were lots of voices in Ukraine saying to the Ukrainian state, to Zelensky, just say Ukraine won't join NATO. Get it off the table. Take away the excuse. Mm-hmm. They could have, without changing anything, because Ukraine wasn't getting into NATO anyway. I mean, it was a BS excuse that Putin used.
Mm-hmm. But that I agree with.
And they could have stopped. They could have just taken away that excuse, and it would have diffused any, whatever popular support there is in Russia for the invasion. How do you justify it to the Russian people if you can say, okay, NATO, Ukraine won't be part of NATO?
Do you think the Russian people have a say in their government?
I mean,
Putin.
Do we?
No. Does the Russian people, because Putin won by 80%, right? So doesn't that show that Russia wants the war to continue?
No.
I know it doesn't, but
no. I mean, the people have.
The
people have less to say than Canadians, but Canadians have next to nothing to say either.
Oh yeah.
But that said, yeah, of course, the elections are phony as hell in Russia. There's a veneer of elections here, and they're not completely phony, but it's mostly veneer. Right. But the elections in Russia are totally a crock. But the nationalist religious narrative is very powerful in Russia. But why does it have power? It goes back to what I said. They didn't allow a normal, natural development of Russia within Europe.
Yes, I agree with you. They didn't get the controls in place or anything as a democracy.
Well, it's like the Versailles Treaty, leads to the rise of fascism in Germany. After World War I, you have such a horrible, onerous treaty on Germany that humiliated everybody.
Right.
It created a fertile soil for extreme nationalism. Things happen now.
I'd also say the response from the world is like when Russia came into Crimea and there was no response. It's kind of like when Hitler went into the Rhineland, what was it, 33 or 36? 33, I think. And he thought the French and everybody would gang up. He only had 20,000 soldiers there, yet the world did nothing.
Yeah, but I don't think it's the same.
No?
No, I think there's very good evidence. First of all, the fact that Crimea was even in Ukraine was a weird anomaly of Khrushchev giving Crimea back to Ukraine during the Soviet Union.
I actually think Crimea was on the table and that Zelensky would have let it go, personally. Just from what I've been reading, that was my supposition.
Yeah, but I'm saying at the time that in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea,
right,
it was a unique situation. And not only was Crimea weirdly in the Ukraine because Stalin, I think it was actually Khrushchev, that gave
Khrushchev.
But there was, after the referendum, which I'm sure was, done not in very open conditions, but 3 Western polling firms went to Crimea after the referendum, and they came up with polling results that were the same as the referendum. The majority of people in Crimea wanted to be in Russia, and that is the real secret of how this thing should have been solved, and maybe still can. There should have been legitimate referendums. Do you want to be in Ukraine? You want to be independent? You want to be in Russia? And the Ukrainian government, pre-invasion, should have organized those things. But as I say, the Ukrainian oligarch was completely corrupt. They were nothing democratic about them.
But there's a thing to be said for the Russians taking the Tatars and Ukrainians out of Crimea prior to the vote.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about some prior, but over decades they had done.
Yeah, well, millions.
But, the Tatars were not for it, but the majority of people in Crimea were. Listen, none of this is going to be pretty or nice or really democratic.
You got that right.
I don't think Crimea was a place for the quote-unquote West, who doesn't give a shit about democracy except to pay lip service when it serves them. That wasn't a place to start a war with Russia.
Okay, good.
And Ukraine had lots of opportunities to solve the Donbas problem without the invasion.
It was a problem created by Russia, though. Sending their little green men into Luhansk and into the Donetsk and taking.
Yeah, but why did that happen? Well, it happened because in 2014, this right-wing government comes to power in Kyiv and starts treating the Russian-speaking people in Donbas like shit.
Okay.
Then what happens is you actually have a very progressive, coming out of the unions and otherwise, workers start to take power in Donbas, not the elites. And Boris Kargalitsky, who's now sitting in jail for 5 years for opposing the war in Russia, he actually started comparing it to the Paris Commune, where the workers took over Paris. So in the beginning,
never heard it this way before, Paul.
But in the beginning, the independence movement in Donbass wasn't even an independence movement. In the beginning, in 2014, for 2-3 years, the demand was for a federated state, something like Quebec is within Canada.
Yes.
Autonomy, have control of their own language laws.
Right.
And the Ukrainian oligarchy turned it down. And they didn't like the far-right policies that came to power in 2014, which included being very anti-union, very, very, very corrupt oligarchy. So in the beginning, the resistance from Donbass was quite legitimate, I think. And but over the years, as the Ukrainian government started between 2014 and 2018, tried to take back Donbass militarily. And the people of Donbass didn't want it and fought. And then that's when Putin starts taking advantage of this. And the little green men start going in.
You had Gherkin go in there and take over government buildings. Are we sure the people didn't want it? How are we basing
the people? It's never homogenous, but my understanding is the majority of Donbass did not want the rule of the Ukrainian oligarchs, but they didn't want to be part of Russia then either.
That's right. Yeah.
They wanted to be federated within Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Then when it started to die down, like in 2018, this is part of the lies of Putin and some of the Putin supporters. The actual war virtually ended in 2018. Like, one of the supposed excuses for the Russian invasion was they thought there was going to be a genocide against Donbass coming from the Ukrainian government. It's just bullshit. There's no evidence of it. From 2018 to right up until just before the invasion, the fighting had completely died down. From 20, if I remember my numbers correctly, based on the OSCC, the Organization for Security in Europe, they had security monitors on the partition line, and they were monitoring the fighting. And you can find these reports online. The number of people that were killed between 2018 and the end of 2021, total non-army deaths, like civilian deaths, was about 320. More people were killed in car accidents. And the military deaths were not much either. They were kind of shelling back and forth, and not much was happening. There was no imminent genocide, total BS. the problem, we have to look at this from a class point of view. The Ukrainian oligarchy are not the good guys. The Russian oligarchy are certainly not the good guys. Both oligarchies didn't give a shit what happened to their own people, to their own workers. The Russians are more, Putin couldn't give damn that hundreds of thousands of Russian workers are now, were slaughtered in the Ukraine. But the same thing's going on now. Well, like, what is the point of continuing this war from the Ukrainian point of view? Why not get a ceasefire, freeze the lines where they are? There's nothing stopping a continuation of a resistance against Russian occupation. If that's what the people want, you can have general strikes.
Right.
You could even, I suppose, have a certain level of military resistance, but a popular resistance would probably be more effective, meaning like strikes. In fact, I think that would have been more effective on day one. The Russian tanks are coming in. Instead of immediately going to an armed resistance, what about, a couple of 100,000 people sit in the highway in front of the tanks? How would that have looked like to the Russian people who would have seen this? In the very beginning, most Russians I talked to said, we'll never invade. The Ukrainians are our brothers and all of this. Right. That would have been reinforced by I'm not a total pacifist, but there's no point to that kind of armed resistance if it is going to turn into a shit show.
Well, it turned into a shit show is what it did. And I appreciate what you're saying about the Ukrainian oligarchs being corrupt, but the Crimea and the Donbas, they just changed oligarchs is what then they got the Russian oligarchs in there.
Yeah, now they do. So let them fight it.
Now,
what there should be,
yeah,
and it's maybe too late for this, there should be a UN-supervised referendum in Donbas, in Crimea, and say, what do you want to do? And that would be a democratic solution.
Well, that's kind of where I wanted to take the conversation, was the lack of power that the UN has now in this world compared to when Pearson and them were doing it. It should have been a ceasefire, but for as good as the UN has done with the Palestine-Israel conflict, I mean, would it have mattered? So now with Zelensky,
and early on,
right?
If NATO had clearly said Ukraine is not joining NATO, right, and in exchange for that had said now there should be referendums and let people decide, maybe it was a shot.
Yeah, something like that. I think the last minute shot. Actually, if I remember right, Zelensky was in a panic trying to tell the Russians that too, wasn't he? From what I read. And as far as that goes, though, I don't believe the NATO, that Ukraine was going to go to NATO, so Russia had to invade. I really don't.
I don't either, but it was a good excuse to invade, and they could.
Well, they had a whole bunch of excuses. Yeah, we got to get rid of the Nazis there, the Jewish president who's a Nazi. And
yeah, I know. I mean, it's all stupid. The only one I think that really resonated with the Russian people is the NATO thing.
Right.
I mean, yeah, if you want to get rid of if you want to denazify Russia first, and then talk about it.
Isn't that true? Do you think Zelensky's done a good job in trying to get the corruption under control as a government?
I don't know. I have no idea. I really don't know. I suspect not, but I don't know.
Right. Because he has to, in order to join the EU, and he's hell-bent on joining the EU, pushing his country towards that, which can't be probably joined till the resolution of this war. So if we were to freeze the lines where they are right now, and maybe have a plebiscite or a UN neutral zone, I don't know if it can be accomplished, but without the reinforcements of the American weapons going into Ukraine, the Ukrainians might have to drift towards this idea of just freezing the conflict. Now, if the conflict is frozen, do you expect it'll be frozen? Do you expect Russia will climb in and have war? Do you think that's the?
No, I think they got what they want. What is the point of trying to occupy Western Ukraine? It would never end.
Right.
Be a war for Russia forever, and whether they dream about such things, what would be the point?
Look what Russia's accomplished. They've got Poland fully armed to the teeth. The Baltic nations. They've got Sweden in the in NATO and in Finland, and he's really ruined his sphere of influence.
Yeah.
By doing what he's doing. Now, he's not a young man, but it seems that everybody waits for the dictator to die, and then things will be better. I'm thinking of Chile and all that. Once Pinochet goes away, it'll be okay. I don't think that rationale ever works.
It depends. I don't think you can generalize. Sometimes it might, and other times it won't. Right now, the problem is in Russia, it's every bit as it's more likely you might get someone more to the right, more militaristic than even Putin. That's a very good possibility. It's unless this thing, it depends what happens in a year or two. The economy's become very militarized.
Right.
So it's created a lot of stimulus. There's economic growth. They're throwing money around like crazy. They're paying off families whose kids die in the war.
Well, he bankrolled this by keeping gold and stuff in stock and having a Russian rainy day fund. So they had plans.
Sustainable. But is it sustainable? So like
no,
a year, 2 years from now?
No. With the Ukrainians bombing the refineries and the oil production and stuff, I think it was last guest we had close to 20% of capacity is reduced now. And that's money in Russia's pocket that they used to finance the war. Now, once that goes away, I mean...
I wouldn't bet on that at all unless some drastic change. No, right now, in the relatively short term, as far as, what do I know? I'm reading stuff like everybody else.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell from what I'm reading, the Russian economy has been far more resilient. The sanctions aren't bothering it. As long as India and China keep buying and others are buying Russian stuff and fuel and all the rest.
And Western companies are also selling to Russia still.
Yeah.
So
generally speaking, as I understand it, economies that are very dependent on militarization, eventually that blows up. It's a kind of Keynesianism that can't be sustained. And two, it's all fueled by the selling of fossil fuel. They're not just a gas station. They have fertilizers and industrial products and arms they sell. There's other parts to the economy. But all parts of the economy are fueled by the fuel, R&D and development. And it's very profound, as I've been told by Russians.
Yeah.
The effect of the fossil fuel. So what happens when one of a few things goes? One is if the price goes down significantly. What happens if countries do get serious about phasing out fossil fuel because of climate? What happens if the Russian economy, just gets so one-sided because of the militarization? So if you start to have deep economic crisis in Russia, that might change the scenario of who comes to power. But the way things are now, I don't see whoever's coming to power is going to be a pro-Western, supposed liberal Democrat. Not that there ever really was one there. Navalny wasn't that anyway. He was just
That's true.
He was just pro-Western.
Yeah, he was a nationalist.
If the West wants to mitigate what could be coming, which is an even more dangerous situation in Russia, is make a deal in Ukraine, normalize things as much as possible, and not feed this toxic nationalist religious fervor in Russia. But of course, it serves the military-industrial complex and others for Russia to be like that. So they don't want to do it.
Well, if that's the case, how come the bill that's stuck in the Congress isn't put through?
Well, it's a kind of small rump in the Republican Party that's blocking this.
Boy, aren't they?
It's part of the Trumpian outlook, which is the main enemy is China.
Mm-hmm.
They don't think the United States should be fighting on two fronts. They want the United States to focus on China. And so making a deal with Russia, mitigating the war in Ukraine, putting the resources more into the American, it's not like they want less military spending. I mean, there's a very odd one, maybe a Rand Paul, maybe. But the majority of them aren't advocating less military spending. They just want it all focused on China.